welcome to All Rise, everyone. Once again, you know me, I'm Derek, Research and Content Director, and with Abdu Murray, author and speaker. And that's all we're going to say about us today.
Yeah.
Normally we banter and waste your time for the first 5 minutes, but today is too important for that. We have a very special guest with us, someone we're both a fan of, who very inspirational. I wish I was this courageous when I was even how old I am now, let alone when I was between the ages of 17 to almost 21. We've got Chloe Cole with us.
Yeah. And we're super excited to have Chloe on. Many of you may know who Chloe Cole is already from her public advocacy as a detransitioner and someone who speaks about gender affirming care and some of the pitfalls for young people, especially in this realm and what this is doing to them. She's a courageous voice, and we're just thrilled to have her on. So we want to have Chloe share her story and get some key insights. We'll have a couple of questions here and there, but for the beginning part of it, we just like to hear your story, Chloe. You've given it before Congress. You've given it before bigger audiences than we have, that's for sure. But our viewers and our listeners will be blessed to hear what you have to say, both, I think, from the cautionary tale, but also, hopefully, by the time we're done, some hope as well. Because here you are, you're flourishing, you're a beautiful young lady, and you've survived this horror to tell us some really important things that I think we can't wait to hear from. So I'll stop talking now and just welcome you to the show. Thank you, Chloe, for being on. We'd love to hear from you about how things have gone and where to go from here.
I really appreciate you guys having me on. So for those of you who don't know me or are not as familiar with my story, I am a 20-year-old woman from the Central Valley of California, and I primarily speak about my experiences as a female detransitioner, somebody who had gone through the process of a medical and social gender transition and back during my childhood, and in favor of the protection of children and families and the rights of parents from this ideology and from these procedures.
Yeah. So tell us about, so you said a couple of things there that I thought were really important. You said, a medical transition, but also a social transition. Is there a distinction between those two things before we get into your story about how this came about? Because it happened to you at a really young age. You started transitioning pretty young. But just give us a definitional difference between the two different transitions you mentioned.
So there's two major components to somebody going through a gender transition. The first is the social aspect of it, which includes changing your name, which may be legally or just how people around you refer to you, asking for people to refer you by the pronouns of the opposite sex, for example, and calling yourself by a different sex. Or the next biggest part of that is changing the way that you present yourself, either through your mannerisms or trying to dress differently. And then the medical transition consists of, for children, the blocking of puberty, depending on what Tanner stage you're at. And then eventually for both adults and children, they go on to have injections of cross-sex hormones and then surgery either of the breasts or the genitalia. Some people choose to get surgery of different areas of their body, like chopping bones out of their shoulders, taking ribs out, shaving the bones out of their face. It's pretty brutal stuff.
Yeah. Right. Wow. So when did your let's go back a little bit to the very beginning. When did your struggles with gender identity really first begin, and what were some of the other underlying reasons why you had those struggles?
I didn't really think that I was a boy for most of my childhood, although I was a bit of a tomboy growing up. I felt like I just found my male peers and my older brothers to be a lot more relatable and easier to understand and interact with than, say, my older sisters and my female relatives, for example. And I thought that femininity just wasn't for me. I thought that I never would want to wear makeup or skirts or dresses, purses. Every time I tried on these things, the older I got, the less comfortable that I felt in it. And really where a lot of that came from was just that I didn't feel like I was close to my female role models or that I was very pretty. I thought that I was the ugliest thing in the world, going through puberty. And I started puberty a little bit earlier than most. I was about 8 or 9 when my breasts visibly started to develop. And there was a lot of unwanted sexual attention that I got. Sometimes from my own peers, they would make comments about my body when we were in the middle of class, or sometimes I would hear about it even from adults around me. So that was incredibly uncomfortable to grapple with while growing up. It looked like it felt like I was being treated like I was already an adult woman when I was just trying to be carefree and innocent as a child and not have to really think about these things. And unfortunately, it did end up materializing into a sexual assault that happened when I was in my 8th grade year of middle school. And the older I got, as I started going to my preteens, I started to feel more like I never was going to be happy as a woman. I just couldn't really fathom growing up from a girl into a fully grown woman and having to go through the process of, well, first starting periods and going through the pains of female puberty, and then being judged for aging, going through the menopause process, and the fear of getting pregnant, the fear of being sexually assaulted, because it had already happened to me once before. I thought that it was bound to happen again. And during that point in my life, I didn't have the confidence to really reach out to anybody for help for that, because I didn't think that anybody could or would. I discovered the transgender community when I first started using social media. And this started with my first smartphone that I got when I was about 11 or 12 years old. And I mostly was using apps like Instagram. This was during the pre-TikTok era, so that wasn't really a thing yet. But a lot of these communities that I would browse around things that I personally was interested in, like arts or video games, also had kids my age who would talk about their personal lives. And they were very similar to me in a lot of ways. Many of them were kind of outcast. A lot of the girls were very tomboyish. The boys were very effeminate. They were very creatively minded. And they had a lot of the same identity issues that I did. But they seemed to find not only this sense of community, but also this confident sense of self through the framework of transgenderism. And what initially started as a curiosity about it became, I'm one of them. I now fully understand who I am, what makes me different, and I have a hopeful pathway that can fix me and everything that's wrong with me and finally make me into a happy person. So I was 12 years old, and in, I think, about my 7th grade year of middle school, when I decided that I was not going to be my mom and dad's daughter anymore. I was going to become their son.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
You know, Abdu, I was just thinking that one of the things that I was talking to my wife about one time was about how much I just love going walking in the woods alone, how it's really peaceful. And she said, I've never felt that before. You're really lucky to have been born a man and to feel like you could peacefully walk in the woods alone.
Yeah.
And what I hear, Chloe, when you're talking is there are a lot of these like very legitimate fears that arise of, you know, your body's changing, things will be, you know, there will be painful things that come that might lead to good things. Like a pregnancy can be painful, but lead obviously to a blessing. But then even the idea of, you know, as a woman, every woman knows that they are more likely to be victimized in certain ways. So, you know, I wonder if that feel like there was even like a safety in numbers in some sense of finding a community, and then not being a girl would, yeah, just make you less likely to be the victim of something against your will. Like, was the fear one of the major parts of that?
Yeah, I'd say that it was probably one of the biggest factors that led to me wanting to not be myself, basically. Like, with all the uncomfortable sexual attention that I was getting, and also having, I grew up in a very precocious environment with my peers. Many of them, we all pretty much had completely unrestricted access to the internet at home. And we also had these school tablets that were not really properly monitored at the time that they first started rolling them out. So a lot of the kids around me would get into some really bad stuff. And of course, because they're children, we would all talk about it with each other and learn all these really wildly inappropriate things at an age that we shouldn't be thinking about them. And amongst my female peers and in the female spaces online, there was a lot of like fear mongering around sexual assault, which is a very real thing, and it does happen to a lot of women. But the way that these other women, these other girls would talk about it was basically like, don't go outside, like just fear for your life all the time and be in this unhealthy mindset that restricts you from doing pretty much anything. I grew up with this mindset that for as long as I was female, my body would be a burden for me. And yeah, women carry most of the reproductive burden, and there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. But pretty much every time that I would have a discussion about it with other women, or read about things that other women would say online, it always focused on the negative aspects on this, and not about the fact that the way that we are made is a gift, and we have the gift of creating life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow, that's really well said. It sounds to me, so I have a couple of questions I'd like to, before we continue on with your story, because the whole thing is really important for people to hear. But if I pause for a moment here and sort of develop more what we're talking about here, is there's gender dysphoria, which is the pervasive disconnect between someone's mental impression of their gender and their physical body. It's relatively rare. There's very few people who actually have it, where it persists past puberty, where they have a persistent mental disconnect between how they feel and what their body actually is. And that's a different kind of phenomenon than I think, that I hear what you're saying. So would you say that you had gender dysphoria, or was it just, I just didn't think being a woman was all that great, considering what I was hearing, and the way out of it was to become a male? You see the difference I'm trying to tease out a little bit here? Is there a difference
Sure.
in your mind?
I mean, I don't think necessarily that the diagnosis of gender dysphoria was incorrect. I mean, it's something that as an adult woman, I still sometimes experience to this day, although not as intense, and not nearly as frequently as I did during my adolescent years or even during my transition. I think what gender dysphoria actually is a symptom, or rather a series of symptoms that stem from deeper problems in one's life, because it's not something that these feelings don't occur in a vacuum. These people aren't just born with this sense of being born in the wrong body or of being the opposite sex. If you look at the personal history of these children, or these men and women who experience these really strong negative feelings around their bodies and around being a member of their sex, they are often neurodivergent. Many of them are on the autism spectrum, or they have another learning disability. And they often have some sort of trauma as well, either relating to their family or their relationship with either their mother or father figure, or their caretaker. Many of them have been abused physically, emotionally, psychologically, or sexually. A disproportionate number of both the men and women, were victims of rape or some form of sexual assault or grooming, especially the younger that you go. I think that the more that you look into these patients' lives and go into their childhoods, the more evident it becomes that this is not just an innate identity that they're born with. It's not a part of them. It's these feelings that naturally are a consequence of the things that they've had to suffer in their lives.
Yeah. Hmm. That's why I wonder about this sense in which it's become a cultural ideology, which takes this real trauma and this real distress people feel about their bodies and about their gender and all these things, and then almost foists an obligation on them to change as opposed to deal with the underlying issues. It seems like a superficial band-aid. And I realize when I say that, I'm not being dismissive of the physical trauma of transition and how hard this is for people to go through. I'm not trying to say that. What I'm saying is it says, well, let's deal with the body. And therefore, we don't ever have to really deal with the underlying issues because we think that the dysphoria is the underlying issue. And what I hear you saying is the dysphoria isn't necessarily the underlying issue. It's a consequence of underlying issues.
Yes, and the model that we used to follow for these patients in previous decades was that we would actually look at their personal history, their past, assess their current mental state and how these things might relate to each other, and then just watch and wait to see how their feelings develop over time while giving them extensive psychotherapy. And now we've left that completely in the past, and we're doctors and psychologists are essentially letting the patient take the wheel. And the course of treatment is based entirely pretty much on how the patient feels and what they want rather than what they objectively need.
Well, I know, like in your case, Chloe, so there is that level of, it's sort of the patient is leading the doctor, but also there's even this level. I know I've heard you talk about before, even of some of the issues you were having, and then you were you suggested to like, oh, maybe your issue is this, you should look into transition, you should look into, was that something that you already kind of knew about, or was that a thing that was foisted in a sense on you to solve something? We don't know what's going on, maybe this will do it.
So for me, I already had the idea of socially and medically transitioning in my mind by the time that I started seeing a psychologist.
Okay.
Because I was already exposed to the transgender community online, and within the community, when people talk about transition and they've already gone through the social transition for a few months to a few years, pretty much all they talk about next is the medical aspect of it. And the way that gender dysphoria and a transgender identity was spoken about within those communities was that it was all immutable, that it's just a part of ourselves, we're born with it, and this is the only treatment that we have. So I was convinced that I had a medical convention. I was convinced that I had a medical condition that made it so that I had more masculine brain patterns and therefore made me actually a young man in the body of a young woman. Now, I also know a lot of detransitioners and a lot of people who have gone through the system as well who did not initially think that they were a member of the opposite sex or have a desire to transition, but they started seeing a therapist because they were distressed, either having body dysmorphia or dealing with sexual trauma, or with other psychiatric issues, and then were suggested to go down this path.
Yeah. Yeah. So take us through then from that point where you had started to see people and the medical transition, physical started to happen. What age were you, and lay it out for us how it happened.
So about a month before my 13th birthday, I told my mom and dad that I now identified as a transgender young man, and I no longer wanted to be their daughter, and I hoped that they would accept me in this new identity. And with that came a lot of mixed emotions for them, because on one hand, they could see that I was a preteen who was trying to maybe understand her role and her identity a little bit better in the world. But they also could see that it was something that wasn't exactly organic either.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They knew that I had been struggling socially and emotionally throughout a lot of my school years, and that I was a bit of a tomboyish girl, and that this was probably going to be a phase for me, that very likely I was going to grow out of it, but I probably had some psychiatric issues that they didn't really know how to address yet. So it was only natural that they wanted to have me see a therapist and maybe help me get these feelings sorted out. But they never had this idea in mind of me actually going on these permanent treatments as a pre-adolescent child. They wanted me to, they wanted things to wait until I was at least 18. They wanted to give me a chance to just grow up and fully go through puberty and maybe grow out of this if this wasn't something that I would really grow into as an adult. But the psychologists that we saw and the physicians, they all had a different idea in mind. So in the state of California, there is a law that makes it so that children at the age of 12 are emancipated when it comes to the mental health care system. And so they can either seek treatment, see a therapist, without the consent or knowledge of their parents, or if their mom and dad do know, they're not required to be in the room unless you give your explicit consent. And so my mom and dad, even though they were the ones who started taking me to therapy, they weren't really allowed in the room with me during these consultations. So they were getting pretty frustrated because they didn't really know what was going on or how they could help me, or where these feelings were coming from. And when they decided to talk to the doctors or talk to the psychologists themselves, well, they brought up their concerns. And they were told that all of their concerns basically were completely invalid, that I was going to be their son no matter what, and that the suicide rates within the transgender community are very high. And this is a common tactic for these psychologists and for these physicians to tell the parents of a gender confused child that the suicide rate, the high suicide rates within the transgender community, or even at the suicidality of their own child, comes from either not being accepted as a member of the opposite sex or not being allowed to medicalize. And that this happens regardless of how young the child is. So my mom and dad are basically given this ultimatum of, you're either going to let your child live as the opposite sex and say yes to her being on these destructive treatments, or you're going to allow her to die and probably take her own life. And that's the last thing that any mother or father would want to hear about their own child. With my mom and dad being convinced that I potentially could die without this treatment, that I was probably going to take my own life, they said yes because they weren't given any other options.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's wow. So let me ask you, did you at those moments, did you feel like I might take my own life if I don't go through transition?
I actually was not suicidal at all until after I began transitioning.
So it was after the transition started is when these thoughts came into your head?
Yes.
Wow.
And that was a consequence of several things that were related to my transition. I started to feel more and more dissociated the further that I went into it, because I was living a lie and putting on a mask every day to everybody around me. And that wasn't easy. But I also wasn't having the real problems that I had, the sexual trauma, and just my general feelings of otherness and not belonging, not being addressed at all by this treatment that supposedly was going to make me happier. And also the psychological and emotional consequences of being on testosterone were very destructive as well. It made it so much harder to just naturally and healthily process the feelings that I was going through just on a daily basis, but also the hidden feelings of distress that I had at the time.
Yeah.
I can see where in a situation like that, you might begin to think, oh, there's just something unchangeably wrong about me.
Yeah.
And I'll never be happy. They're doing the changes now. I'll never be happy. And, one of the things that we know from good research is that suggesting suicide to someone can make them suicidal.
Yeah.
Suicide has this social contagion sort of issue alongside of it. And, the CDC has specific guidelines. And that's one of the things that kind of infuriates me about this whole issue is people know this and they just keep saying it. And they have to know that at some level, I think, that they are suggesting and influencing people to actually, maybe I'm sure at some level they genuinely care, but at another level, you have to know that based on everything we know, when you tell someone, if you don't do this, you're going to commit suicide, if they've never thought of it before,
they are now.
They are now.
Yeah.
It's an extremely irresponsible way for these clinicians to handle the subject of suicide, because by talking about it in a black and white manner, by saying that it's inevitable, by saying that it's inevitable if you don't do this or that, it's going to eventually lead to more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can see the despair that creeps in. It's like you either do this incredibly traumatic thing of putting your body through this, or you die. It's like, oh my goodness. Without making light of it, it does sound just like that game Would You Rather, where you propose to somebody two possible positive outcomes, but they both have serious negative consequences. So which of the negative consequences would you want more, or want less? And so would you rather do this or that? Both are kind of good, but serious bad attaches to it. And it seems like it's this almost grotesque game where you play with someone's emotions and their life by saying, here's two options, neither of which is great, but which one would you rather have? And it just seems to be despair-inducing. So it doesn't surprise me that someone might feel suicidal after that kind of a thing. Yeah.
And there's actually a third option.
Yeah. There's a third option they don't even tell you about. Yeah. So
I'm wondering real quick, what is something that you wish some adults in your life would have said to you at that moment? That might have helped you deal with that and not be faced with that in that situation.
Well, the best thing that I could have been told was no. You cannot be the opposite sex. Nothing that you do to your body will actually make you into a young man. You are always going to be a young woman, and that is an immutable trait about you. But also, these problems you have with your body are not because you were born wrong. Your body is not the issue. It's the negative feelings that you have around it and wherever those feelings might have stemmed from. If somebody had just told me the truth and encouraged me to find my identity, not in the way that I looked or in my body, but through the things that I did, and just allowed me to grow up like any other young girl, I never would have gone through this.
Yeah. Boy, the thing you said the past 45 seconds, if you're watching this or listening to this, you got to rewind that and then listen to it again, and then rewind it and then listen to it again, because that was very succinctly said, but powerfully stated right there. This idea of being born wrong, and it's not your body, it's your negative feelings about it, is so, so very important, because you're actually addressing the whole person. It's not just your negative feelings must be the truth. It's let's work through what your negative feelings mean and why they are the way they are and all these things. Please, if you're watching, listening, go back and listen to that again, and then listen to it again, and then join us again on this part of the opposite side of the rewinding. So how did the transition go? Like, what happened? So you're 13. You're starting to go through this thing, and it lasted for some time.
So I was 13 when I began the medical part of things, and that started with injections of a drug called Lupron to stop my puberty, and then weekly injections of testosterone to make me appear and sound and look more like a young man. Now, Lupron is a drug that has actually been subject to many lawsuits before it started being used for children who have gender confusion. It's previously been used as a cancer drug to treat reproductive conditions in women, for precocious puberty, like children who are starting puberty when they're literally like toddlers, like 3 to 4 to 5 years old. And it's also been used as a chemical castration agent in sex offenders of children. And the reason why it's been in so many lawsuits is because it's such a horrific drug for the body to be on. It works by basically cutting off all of the communication between the brain and the gonads, meaning the testicles in men or the ovaries in women. And a lot of consequences come not only from that, but also probably from the side effects of the drug as well. And I was being put on it as a perfectly healthy 13-year-old girl who was having a normal puberty. And because I was already a few years into puberty, I basically experienced like an artificial childhood onset menopause for the duration that I was on it. So I was 13, 14 years old, experiencing hot flashes, uncontrollable like sweating and itching, and emotionally like I felt very numb while I was on it because I wasn't having a hormonal cycle anymore. It was just like I was basically in a biological stasis. So naturally, I wanted to move on to the next step and not be on this thing just on its own forever because it sucked. A lot of these activists and these doctors will claim that this is a drug that just creates a temporary pause, which, I mean, you can't just stop a normal biological process and not expect there to be any consequences from that. There's no guarantee that puberty is going to begin again after a patient is taken off of it. And they usually have patients on this for years, often up until they turn 18. And so they go into their adult years missing entire chunks of necessary adolescent development, both physically, reproductively, and potentially even psychologically. And so the testosterone was the natural next step. And it was like a completely different drug. Like I felt amazing when I first started it during that first year. Because, I mean, for one, I was experiencing all the physical changes that I was told would make me happy and feel more whole and closer to my true self as a young man. I started to look like pretty much any other teenage boy and also get a deeper voice than a lot of my male peers, weirdly enough. My voice did not sound then the way that it does now. It's kind of a miracle that I even have the voice of a woman these days. But it also has psychological and emotional consequences. I wasn't going through the ups and downs of a menstrual cycle anymore. I now had this constant, like, almost like this feel-good stimulant kind of drug in my veins. So especially like that change from just like having no hormones circulating in my body to having a literal steroid injected in me every week, I thought that it was making me happier. And for a little bit, it was like kind of like blunting like whatever negative emotions that I had, and I felt more confident. I felt like I could put myself out there more. I started to feel a little bit more like I had a bit of a competitive edge with other people. And it was like I had this weird, rapid personality change almost. And so by the time that I went into my freshman year of high school, I looked and I started being treated like just another 14-year-old young man. By that point in time, I started these treatments when I was about halfway through my 8th grade year. And I was like, I'm not going to tell anybody that I identify this way or ask them to call me a young man, because they've all known me since elementary school, and I know I'm not fooling anybody. So I'm just going to wait until I'm at the next school and I don't have to deal with all these people anymore. And so for most of my high school years, I was being socialized as a young man. And it was kind of exciting, all the changes that were happening. Like, it was a totally different dynamic. I didn't have to deal with like all the female drama and the female hierarchy and everything like that. It was kind of a relief in some ways. And I started interacting with other young men not other young men. I obviously wasn't actually a young man, but I started being accepted amongst them. And I even was using like male restrooms and locker room facilities, which was nasty. And if there's one part of high school that I would like to forget, that would probably be it. High school boys' restrooms are nasty. That is not the place to be.
They don't get much better in adult male spaces either, like airports, whatever.
No,
they're not much better. So I wish I could say it got better after high school. It just didn't.
no.
Go.
The amount of people who like don't like lock the stall door behind them is astounding. You would never. There's so many things that you would never see in a woman's restroom.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Another podcast,
real horror show. Yeah.
Yeah. There are just a lot of changes in a lot of different areas of my life during this time, and it was very novel in a lot of ways. But eventually, the excitement of it just went away, and I still was a high schooler, and I still had to live life, and I still had a lot of issues again that weren't actually being addressed by this. But eventually, I actually started to become worse.
Okay.
I started to self-medicate and use substances, partially because of peer pressure and kind of giving into what a lot of my friends or other kids my age were doing at the time.
Yeah.
But also because like I felt so just horrible in my own skin. I was just way worse off. And by the time that I entered my sophomore year of high school, I actually was diagnosed with depression and social anxiety, and they started adding even more medication to the mix to basically put a Band-Aid on the real problems that I had that I would talk about during therapy. And they basically were like, oh, okay, I'm sorry that you feel that way. Do you want more drugs?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Wow.
That's pretty much how the therapy system works these days.
Yeah.
And because like I was convinced that this was going to make me happy and that it was going to make me into my real self. I had no concept of detransition at this time. I didn't know that regret or even just transition not working out was a thing, because that was never discussed. So I thought, well, maybe the reason why I feel unhappy again is because I need to go deeper. I still have my breasts and I'm still hiding them every day, but it's not like I'm not wearing this uncomfortable compression device to squish my breasts into my rib cage, and then I still have breasts by the end of the day, you know? I thought that my chest was the next problem. And in order to really be happy, then I would have to continue my transition and get rid of them. By this point in time, you know, I had the hidden sexual trauma that I wasn't really given the opportunity to address and work out in my head, or even get justice for when it happened. But I also had this frustration of like, well, I'm supposed to be like a young man, and yet I still have breasts. I can't take off my shirt without having them there. I can't swim shirtless. I can't work out shirtless like the other boys my age. So maybe I should do something about it. And so I believe my surgery consultations began when I was about 14. I started expressing these feelings of distress again about my chest. So first my therapist, and I started being referred to somebody who makes referrals to surgery and other treatments. And it was pretty much a straightforward process into getting surgery.
So pretty quick, it sounds like. There was no further psychological evaluation. There was none of that. Just like, you want this, it'll happen.
I believe that I first brought it up to my therapist. Well, I believe the time that between me first bringing it up to a psychologist and then actually going under the knife was a little under a year, maybe about 9 months.
Okay.
And they were pretty much ignoring the fact that I was diagnosed with depression and I was being medicated for it, and that I had these feelings of social isolation, um, and instability.
Hmm. Yeah. So you mentioned that, you know, you had started to feel suicidal after the transition started, but the testosterone made you feel great for a while. So
A little bit.
I assume that subsided, any suicidality subsided when you felt great chemically, but did it creep back in afterwards, you know, when you were sort of realizing I'm not really fitting in because I can't do the things that males normally do?
That was a big component of it. There definitely is there is like a honeymoon period for all of the treatments and all the changes that you make. And nobody really talks about that, or the fact that these feelings eventually go away, and that that's just not a natural way to live. You're not supposed to feel ecstatic every day, all the time, every waking moments. And really, that sometimes personal distress or feelings of discomfort with yourself are just a part of life. So I thought that I had to escape pretty much any feelings of distress that I had around myself, around my body. Um, and because of the alienness of these procedures, especially the surgery, and how difficult they really are on the mind and the body, I it made me want to take my own life, especially during the post-op period. At first, there was like a week or so of like, wow, this is so exciting, and like the hardest part is finally done. I'm finally be able to fully heal and have a more masculine chest and not have to worry about my breasts anymore. And I can finally just leave behind all the traces of my old self as a young woman. And then that never happens. And it physically was a difficult process, having to deal with the stitches and the wounds and everything. And emotionally, it was hell, because I was having to contend with the fact that I just lost parts of my body and parts of myself as a woman, for the rest of time, that never were going to come back.
Wow.
And when I first went onto these procedures, I didn't really understand what that fully meant. It was about a year after my surgery, or less actually, when it started to really hit me that this was something that I regretted, that I wanted to become a mom one day, that I never would be able to breastfeed my children. I never would even have a chance at doing that because my breasts were already gone. And even just transitioning itself was something that it just it hit me that it was destroying me, that I wasn't feeling any more like myself, but I was losing major parts of my development into a young woman. And I wanted to be beautiful. I wanted to be feminine. I wanted to feel comfortable with myself as a woman. And that really was all that I desired from the very beginning. And I was just running away from that. And that was being facilitated by adults around me who were supposed to know better.
It sounds to me like the normal feelings of adolescence coupled with some pretty serious things that are abnormal, in the sense of you're not supposed to be abused and go through sexual trauma. That's something outside of what I think is the moral norm for every human being. And the other things you went through, masked and overshadowed and overpowered just the Chloe just wants to be a woman. She just wants to grow into a woman, and all these things piled on to mask all that, and it resulted in what amounts to a stolen childhood.
Absolutely. And I mean, very earlier on in my childhood, I actually was very feminine. I loved playing with my Bratz dolls and my Monster High dolls, and my dad once told me that I couldn't even go out of the house, when I was like 6 or 7, without like wearing like a bright outfit or like a big tutu. I was like pretty much the archetypical girly girl. And yeah, the older I got, the more I felt like I naturally aligned with these masculine interests. But at my heart, I just wanted to be a beautiful, bubbly young woman. And my mom and dad even brought this up before I even went through all of the chemical and surgical parts of transition. They said, they told the doctors, like, what if this is just a phase that she's going through? Because she used to be the most pink loving, girly child we had ever had out of all of our kids. And why can't we just let her grow up and be who she is without that? And I started reflecting on a lot of this after the post surgery period, and when I began to detransition at 16, um, it was so painful grappling with how pretty much all of my teenage life, a big chunk of my childhood had been ripped away from me. And I didn't really know how to cope with that.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, it's a heavy thing for, I mean, you're not supposed to go through it. So
Yeah.
No.
this type of stuff. And so that's a lot to have on your shoulders at any age.
Yeah, at any age, let alone in your mid-teens.
When other people are meant to be helping you and protecting you. And
Yeah.
yeah.
A couple of questions to sort of follow up on the sort of the story is that when did you and how did you realize this is not what I'm supposed to do? I need to find myself again in terms of the way I was born.
It was during that point in time when I was reflecting on how the surgery had damaged my body and all the other treatments had as well, and how this lie I had been living for going into my teenage years um, was ripping me apart. And I didn't know how to go about things because there was no guidance on detransition or even any mention of it before. But I knew that I had to stop my transition. And for a little bit, I couldn't feel like I could call myself a woman. I thought that I didn't deserve to without breasts, or when I didn't feel pretty anymore, or after years of living as a young man, I thought, how could I ever go back to calling myself that? I don't look anything like the other girls my age. I'm nothing like them because I've been socialized as a guy for a pretty crucial chunk of my childhood now. I don't know how I'm going to go back, but I'm going to stay determined and see where this takes me. And it was one of the hardest periods of my life
I can imagine.
ever. Those last few years of my adolescence were really difficult for me to go through in a lot of ways. Trying to catch up with my other peers because I was so stunted from not only the treatments, but also just from living this way for years and being misled. And there was no medical guidance because there are no standards of care for those of us who detransition. There's no recognition in the healthcare system for people who regret it and choose to go back.
Wow.
And
yeah, you don't think
that
about
really
that. You just don't think about that. Like there's this whole protocol to get you to transition, but there's nothing about, because they assume, well, once you transition, you'll be happy with it. There's nothing to reverse the process
and
or to help you.
And if you're not, it's not our problem. You signed the
you signed the form.
Signed the form. So
my goodness,
Yep.
you don't think about that very often. Wow.
That was basically the attitude. Like I would talk about my regret with like some of these different doctors and psychologists, and it was like, well, you said yes to this, and we thought it was okay because of that. Like they were grown adults, like facilitating basically the destruction of a young girl. I wasn't even a woman yet. And so they had a very callous, almost like laissez-faire attitude when it came to my detransition. And I asked several times, even for my name and my sex marker to be changed back in the system. I still get letters from my old healthcare provider that address me as a young man named Leo. Yeah. To this day.
Wow. Oh, wow.
They didn't listen.
Yeah. Wow.
And socially with my friends, I was going into my senior year of high school as a completely different person than they had known me for years. Like, I had some friends who knew me in middle and elementary school who knew already that I was actually a woman. But for the most part, like, everybody was convinced that I was just a normal young man. So it was jarring for them to see me go through this rapid change in my personality and my mental state, and also just like the way that I dressed and presented myself. But a lot of them actually thought that I was a transgender woman, which made me feel even more insecure, because it was like, no, I'm a woman. I'm real. I'm not lying. I'm not trying to be something that I'm not. But I got picked on really badly during this point in my life. And I went through the last year of high school being bullied and isolated, and even having rumors going around about me that I was like a bad person, that I slept around. And it was like I was jumping into like the worst parts of like the female high school experience just suddenly.
All at once.
And for like the rest of my high school career.
Wow.
And it got to the point that I dropped out of school, because it was like, I'm so depressed, I can't even focus on my coursework, and nobody here even likes me. So why am I here? And this was probably the closest point in my life to me actually taking my own life. And I started to even think about planning it. But I still had this drive for some reason to keep going on, to see where life might lead me, what life might look like for me as an adult, even though I wasn't very confident about it. But I just kept going, and I got my diploma equivalent. I started making friends outside of school. I started reaching out to friends who had moved away. And eventually I also discovered that I wasn't alone, and that some of my friends had also detransitioned and desisted. But also, there was an entire and a massive community of other detransitioned women and men in the online world. And that was really a major part of my healing up until this point. Having other people who knew my pain and could help guide me through it and help me to understand that there was a life after going through all of this.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. I just want to think about for a moment. So I'm writing a book called Reality Collapse, and it takes a look at two different things. One I call identitarianism, which is this sort of ideological thing that has nothing to do with transgenderism so much as it's got this identity ideology where you have to do these things and you're the sovereign king of the universe and you can change anything you want. And we foster that no matter what. We make this omelet and there's lots of eggs that get broken, and we're okay with the breaking of the eggs, so to speak. The other thing has to do with some artificial intelligence issues. But reality collapse is this idea that we just don't need to trust our own eyes or trust our own sense or our biology or anything like that. And so when you were talking about that story just now, I thought about the double irony of the truly collapse of reality, which is you're going through something as a normal human being, as a normal child goes through, and then we collapse reality by saying, well, you need to fundamentally change your body and your biology and your biochemistry. And that's considered fine. That collapses a reality, and it resulted in all the negative stuff you went through. Then when you decide to say, you know what? No, my body's rebelling against this. This is not making me happy. I want to go back to who I am, who I really truly am. And then people got on you about it. And that collapses reality in a double sense, because you're trying to go back to reality and you're being assaulted for it, emotionally and otherwise. That's just, it just really speaks to the way in which, if we don't value foundational truth anymore and foundational truth about what it means to be human, your story is unfortunately not uncommon. You're not rare in that sense, which is why it's so important for you to say what you're saying. And your courage is rare, I'll tell you that. But your story is far too common. So I'm so glad you're saying what you're saying. I'll let you comment on that if you want to, but I do have a question. I have two questions for you. One is a little bit more of a harder question. I'd love to get your views on this. And if you're not comfortable, that's okay too. But the other one's going to have to do with, because we're a faith-based podcast, I'd love to ask you about that if you don't mind my asking about it.
Of
But the
course.
first thing I want to ask is this. What would you say to someone, and I know you've seen the stuff online and all this stuff, to someone like an Elliot Page, who says they're happier, this is the best thing that ever happened to them, and otherwise I would have been dead? What do you say to someone who's gone through the transition and says that kind of thing? How do we unpack that kind of a thing?
It's not going to make you happy.
Mm-hmm.
If you are chasing a lie, if you're living a lie every day, and you're trying to become something that you are not, and you never will be. That is not what happiness means.
Mm-hmm.
You are not actually fulfilling anything. And I know what it's like to experience gender dysphoria. I know what it's like to have those feelings of deep distress around your body and wanting to just change everything about it. But the problem is not you. Because we're all made beautifully in the image of God, as male and female. And no, it's not always going to be easy. It's not supposed to be.
Yep.
But we have a lot of gifts, and it's up to us to realize that. If you live your life constantly chasing happiness or the next big thing, you are never truly going to feel fulfilled.
Mm. Mm.
And the truth is, this is going to shorten your life.
Yeah.
It's not bringing you any health. The body is not meant to experience these treatments long term. But you can always go back. There's this phrase that is always floating around in the trans community: death before detransition. Well, I detransitioned, and I'm not only still alive, but I'm doing better because of it. So don't be afraid to live the way that you were made. And that doesn't mean that as a man or a woman, you aren't allowed to express yourself the way that you want to, whether you're more feminine or more masculine, because everybody is different. You can be yourself without applying a label, or without going through an entire medical routes.
Wow. So how has your faith helped you through this whole thing, and what role does it play in your life now and as you pursue fulfillment?
So faith wasn't really a part of my life until after I started detransitioning, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people have this misconception that it was because of religious beliefs that I stopped my transition.
Right.
But if anything, it was just the beginning of knocking down these spiritual walls
Mm-hmm.
that were holding me back, because I was living a lie, a delusion. I believed that I wasn't created in God's image, that I wasn't beautiful the way that I was, that there was something that was fundamentally wrong with me, to the point that I had to change myself through surgeries and lifelong medication.
Mm-hmm.
But as I began to speak out publicly about my journey, about my experiences, and connect with all these different mothers, fathers, detransitioners, eventually I started noticing that the most loving and forgiving people were the Christians. And these people were not only collaborating with me and having me speak with them, but they also were, in a way, spiritually giving me a place to stay. They were giving me guidance. They were holding me accountable the way that I needed to be. And the more that they spread the gospel to me, the more that I came to and healed from this ideology that previously I'd felt completely destroyed me and my life.
Mm.
And I think it was the single greatest missing piece of my puzzle. It was what led me to not really fully understanding myself and the world, to isolating myself, and eventually feeling like I had to change and disfigure myself as an adolescent. It was what led me down this path of self-mutilation and destruction. That lack of a spiritual foundation for most of my life. And it was when I realized that I also realized that the best thing that I could do was embrace my relationship with God.
Mm.
If I wanted to truly become whole and heal from everything.
Wow. Well, boy, I'd like to go cry for an hour after that. That was beautiful. I'm covered in like,
Yeah, goosebumps.
goosebumps.
Yeah,
That
me
was,
too. Me too. That was amazing,
thank
Chloe.
you, Chloe, for sharing that.
Yeah.
It our time is short, but we wanted to end with one specific question because there is this idea that, well, like you just mentioned, death before detransition. But you are an example of the flourishing that can happen. Yeah, you could say life after detransition. So what are the things just that bring you joy today, that fill your life with value, that other people could maybe look forward to also?
Well, from pretty much the beginning of my detransition, I knew that I wanted to become a mother one day and have children of my own. And just working towards that and thinking about myself as a mother and a wife one day, that brings me a lot of hope and a lot of happiness.
Mm.
And another big part of the reason why I began speaking out was because of the children in my own life. You know, I obviously am not a mother yet.
Mm-hmm.
I'm 20 years old and unmarried, and it's just not a part. It's just not going to be a part of my life yet. But I started to have a lot of little ones come into my life at around the time that I stopped transitioning, and it was kind of my first glimpse at the true beauty and purity of a child and a child's innocence, and just of childhood in general. And it's not only my little nieces and nephews and the children in my life are not only a light in my life, but they also keep me going
Mm.
because they're a reflection of how beautiful the future is, how beautiful humanity is. And having been on this journey of publicly speaking out about my experiences, it hasn't been easy in a lot of ways. There's been a lot of hardships, what with the frequent traveling that I do and all the work that I do, and just the emotional tax of it all at times. But I feel like because I chose to say yes to this opportunity, because I chose to turn my life around, turn around all the pain that me and my family had been through for the greater good, it's allowed me to connect with so many wonderful people. Um, these mothers, these fathers, um, who've had to deal with this with their children. These other detransitioners and people who had been through this. All of these wonderful fighters. I'm so glad to know them. I'm so glad that they are part of my lives, and that I think many of us are going to be lifelong friends. It's brought me a lot of joy and a lot of purpose in my life that I really needed for years, to be able to fight for something so dear to me alongside such wonderful people.
Mm. Wow. That's terrific. Chloe, we're just blessed that with all the advocacy and all the work you're doing to not just expose something that is destructive, but to offer something that is constructive. We're just blessed that you spent some time with us.
Absolutely.
That you shared so candidly and so powerfully with us and with our audience. We thank God that you did find that reason to go on, even when you didn't see a whole lot. All of us the world is a richer place because you kept going and because because you're doing what you're doing. Thank you for giving us the time. I have no other, there's nothing I would close with other than just great gratitude. Very serious gratitude. Yeah. Thanks for being a part of All Rise.
Yeah, thanks.
And thank you for having me and having me be a part of your platform.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, God bless you. We'll be praying for you. We'll be praying for that coming motherhood in whatever form it takes. We're just excited for the mom you're going to be.
Thank you so much. That really means a lot.
Great. You're going to be great at it.
Yeah, I hope so.
You will.
Right. All right. Thank you.
God bless you, Billy. Bye-bye.
And God bless you.
Well, Abdu.
Yeah, Derek.
That was a heck of a conversation.
Yeah.
And I know that there are a lot of things that she touched on that have been major things that you've talked about for a long time. And, she's very much living if they want to say some of the stuff that theologians or apologists talk about is theoretical, she's sort of putting some, kind of manifesting a lot of these ideas. And we were just kind of talking about one, and we thought, okay, let's hash this out a little bit.
I mean, she really is the personification of all the things we think we are right based on our theology. And then you talk to someone like Chloe Cole, and you're like, oh my goodness, the Bible knows what it's talking about. It's as if the divine being actually wrote this thing and knows what it means to be human. And one of the things that stuck out to me during our conversation with Chloe, where she talked about this sort of negative feelings about what it means to be a woman, the fear attendant to being a woman, the biological issue you get to go through, the lack of safety issues, all these things. And then we asked her about her faith. And she talked about being made beautifully and wonderfully in the image of God as male and female.
Yeah.
And I think this goes back to that whole idea of essentialism, that there is an essence to a woman in her womanness. There is an essence to a man in his manness. This maleness and his femaleness is not incidental. It's Genesis 1:27. In his image did he create them, male and female did he create them. And it's not accidental or incidental. It's essential. And I wondered, had she been told early on, not once, not twice, but inculcated with an entire worldview that says being a woman reflects something of God's image that being a man does not, and being a man reflects something of God's image that being a woman does not, that there is something about being compartmentalized in the sense of you're a woman and you're fearfully and wonderfully made and beautifully made in God's image as a woman, that maybe would have helped her go through the natural discomfort that we all attend to because of I'm not happy with the kind of boy I am. I'm not happy with the kind of girl I am. The awkward phase. Everyone has their awkward phase. I could show pictures of the awkward phase where you're like, seriously, ugly duckling, kind of a thing. Everyone has that. I'll get through mine soon, I think. But
you beat me to it.
Yeah, I knew you were thinking it. But I just think about that foundational issue, and it comes down to that foundational truth, because you can collapse reality quite easily if the people you're collapsing it for don't know what it is, and they have no foundation for what it is. If it's transient, if it's given to malleability, and it's not transcendent, well, then you can collapse it all you want. And then you have real human detritus. You have real human consequences to this whole thing. Yeah. It's an artificial solution, and it's no surprise then that artificial solutions have natural consequences. The natural consequence of artificiality is self-loathing and eventually wanting to end your life and lack of meaning. But then she comes back to it. She sees that beauty, and she wants to continue on with her life. And I think it was God who kept her that whole way.
There was just this driving force towards like, there's something better. There's life. There's something waiting.
Yeah.
That it's that sort of that still small voice.
Yeah. Even before she fully committed her life, there was that still small voice. If the hound of heaven, God continues to pursue people. And I think that's true of people who actually have transitioned and maybe are happy with their transition at this moment. But as Chloe said, whenever you're pursuing something that isn't reality, there's going to be this nagging, like, dissatisfaction with it. And to see her flourish, not just survive, is really inspiring.
Yeah. I know she's talked previously too. I was listening to an interview of her and talking a little bit about her growing up and her parents, who I really felt for a lot in hearing more about them today. And like they are just trying to do the best for their daughter in a very confusing situation. And
it's already confusing, and then doctors make it more confusing by being so certain.
We've got some podcasts on things like that too. But you know, and she talked about sort of being raised, and I guess you would call it maybe in some sense a nominal Christian household. I don't think she's gone into maybe that much. I don't know what it was necessarily kind of like, but she mentioned that, you know, I think her father was a Mormon, her mother was a Catholic, or I could have that reversed. But anyway, they had sort of grown maybe more towards agnosticism or atheism as she was growing up. And she said without that foundation, she really felt adrift. She had no anchor to reality. She had no story. She had no purpose to who she was, her creation. Why am I here? There's just nothing. And you're a child, basically being asked to create this narrative for yourself. And we're all trying to fit in, and we're all being made fun of, and we all fall into these, okay, am I going to hang out with this group and we're all going to be made fun of, but at least we're together? Or am I going to can I get into this group where I'm really good at making fun of other people, so I become a bully? And, you know, we're all trying to like protect ourselves in these early social situations. And that's one of the more sort of maybe insidious parts of this, is that it does creep into this natural weakness that can exist. And I think it's going to happen more. I don't think it's any surprise that this rises up in these generations that are being churched less, that are having less of God, less of Jesus in their home. And that's just going to open them up to, I think, these sorts of things to infiltrate.
And it does go back to that sense of what is the real? What is the world? Where is that grand narrative? And I don't mean narrative in terms of a fake story you tell yourself. That's not what you mean. Certainly, it is, where do I actually objectively fit in to this entire world? And that's why, you know, you look at various holy books, and they have stories in them, and some of them are entirely stories. We have the Bible, which is this compendium of books that are historical. Sometimes the historical books have poetry in them and have prose in them. They have law, all this stuff. But there's something about the biblical narrative, and the biblical narrative told through not only the laws given and the wisdom literature and the poetry, but there is this story of from fall all in redemption all the way to ultimate consummation of what the history will have as its end, which will be in eternity. You find yourself in it, and you find out who you really are in this whole thing. And that's one of the beauties of the Christian faith, is not that it's actually just true, but it's beautiful. And I think it's not only beautifully true, but honestly, when you look at these whole things and you see someone like Chloe thrive, it's not only beautifully true, it's truly beautiful. And she finds herself. And anybody else who's watching this, who's having whatever your issues are, and I still have mine, you still have yours, you find yourself in the middle of life's waves, not being floundering because you're anchored to something firm and solid and foundational. That's actually true. So those are just some of the thoughts I had that emerged. I get about 1 billion thoughts that emerged from that conversation. If you haven't watched the whole thing and you caught part of it or whatever it is, you need to make sure you watch all of it. Chloe Cole delivered a very powerful message that you and I will be thinking about long after we're done talking here.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's a wrap. Until then, ladies and gentlemen, the defense rests.